What's for Raycon?
I've always wanted to do this video, but I've always put it off because I feel like a million other people have already kind of done this. But I'm at a point where I need to make something I am passionate about, because making videos recently has slowly become not fun. And I got a whole new boatload of trauma, which means I'm 20% funnier. Sonic quickly became my newest comfort character, as if he wasn't already, after you know what happened. I'm not gonna retread what I said in my Sonic Prime video. Go watch that if you want me to explain. Now, I am a real Sonic fan. I got the watch, I got the socks, I got the underwear. Oh yeah, I guess that's here too. My first Sonic game was Sonic Heroes, back when I was young and bad at games. And when I say bad, I mean, I also played the Sonic Ultimate Genesis collection. I fell in love with all the Sonic games that came out before I was born. I was catching up on the world of Sonic before I even realized that the games were older than I was. I'm going to assume you guys know the basics, so I'm gonna speed through all the stuff you probably already know. Get it? Speed? Like the drug? The year was 1989 in North America, and Nintendo had a chokehold on the newly developing gaming market. This was before both PlayStation or Xbox debuted, and there was one company willing to go after the massive juggernaut that was Mario, and they needed to come out with a console soon, because the Super Nintendo was coming out in only a couple years. Sega released the Genesis console, and their angle was to be better in every way, in terms of graphics and performance. But that's not all they needed. They knew Mario was too recognizable, and that recognizability was a major factor for selling consoles for Nintendo. So they needed their own mascot for the Genesis. They needed that level of recognizability, and they decided they need a mascot that's the opposite of Mario. Mario is known for being fun and family-friendly. In 1991, ironically the same year the Super Nintendo released, they released Sonic. Cool, edgy, a bit of a bad boy. They angled it for those hip and young teenagers that like staying out late and using their fake ID to get alcohol to look cool at their friend's party.
About his attitude. Smarty pants! Why can't it be more like that nice boy Mario? Oh!
Now, in order to really grasp why this was such a big deal, imagine if Drifter's Burgers decided they wanted to compete with McDonald's. Mario was big, and the idea that Sega, who had a failed console before this, they wanted to go against that. That's ballsy, which is why Sonic makes even more sense. You gotta have the same attitude as Sonic to do something that risky. Hey, did you guys know this video is sponsored by Raycon's Everyday Earbuds with their noise isolating technology? Are your siblings having a shouting contest while you're trying to read? Well, don't worry, Raycon is here to save the day. Not only are they noise isolating, but they're also half the price with the same great quality as other brands. Their team of in-house audio engineers designed these earbuds themselves, and they have 3 customizable sound profiles, earbud tap functions, crystal clear sound quality, along with being water and sweat resistant. They're flush with your ears so they don't hurt after wearing them for hours on end. Okay, real talk, these have actually been absolutely super amazing whenever I go somewhere and I want to read a book and it's super noisy, and I'm able to read pretty much anywhere. I use these primarily to drown out noise in public when I want to read. Or when I'm listening to an audiobook when I'm walking the dogs. Do you have any idea how useful this has been for me recently? I actually like it. Click my link below or go to buyraycon.com/negativelegend for 15% off your order, plus free domestic shipping or a flat free shipping for international. Thanks to Raycon for sponsoring this video. The thing that made Sonic unique was that it was a platformer that focused on speed. Since there weren't really save files during this time, people were already starting from the beginning of every game and trying to speed through the first levels to get where they wanted to. And that was the core idea behind Sonic. Use that concept to your advantage. Not only that, but it was how you ran through the levels that mattered. In most levels, you want to try to stay up high as best you can. The lower you go in the level, the harder it becomes, punishing you for your mistakes. Staying high will reward you for your mastery of the game. The goal of the game was to speed through it, which was revolutionary for the time. That same core idea is still implemented in modern Sonic games. Heck, in Sonic Frontiers, there's some levels where you kind of just jump over the whole level and you can make it to the end pretty fast. And the best part is, just like learning every move to a boss in Dark Souls and beating them GG easy, this style of gameplay is very satisfying. Okay, now let's really speed through this. Sonic 2 is the first appearance of Tails, Sonic's sidekick, created to be a foil to Sonic that's more reserved and not as fast, but can fly, so that's cool. Sonic CD was the first appearance of Amy Rose and Metal Sonic. Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles initially were supposed to be one game, but you can see how that turned out. Anyway, this was the first appearance of Knuckles, who was initially supposed to be a villain working for Eggman, but don't worry, you know how that turns out too. Sonic has a way of making enemies into friends. And then there was a bunch of spin-offs that weren't all that important. It was firmly the Mario of Sega. Every console was getting a Sonic game to help sell. But now it's time for the 3D era of Sonic. Sonic has had a rough time since going 3D. Would plague every review for almost every game during this time period. Don't get me wrong, Sonic 3D and their initial attempts to make Sonic work in 3D deviated heavily from the core philosophy of Sonic. That being, he don't go fast anymore. Skipping over failed and canceled projects that never saw the light of day, we jump to one of the most influential Sonic games released for the Sega Dreamcast. Sonic Adventure would become the breakout hit that they needed, as it radically changed the way Sonic would be forever. Sonic Adventure was where Sonic really started being ambitious with its story, creating a whole world where each character had their own story that you could play through. An interconnected story with a big overarching story. And this would largely cement the mindset of what Sonic is for the future. And with its sequel, we got the forever fan favorite Shadow the Hedgehog, the somehow even edgier version of Sonic. If Sonic is the Happy Meal, Shadow is the unhappy meal. Now, the story of these games up until the Adventure series, well, they didn't really have a story. They just had a premise that would get you through the game. The Adventure series introduced an actual narrative that would eventually get a little screwy when the comics came in, and when they decided to pivot the games again later on. But when people nowadays think of Sonic, they usually think of Sonic Adventure, especially for modern hardcore Sonic fans. Though these games would also cement odd performance issues for 3D Sonic games, which for some reason just seems like they can't fully escape. Now we're at a point where PlayStation and Xbox have entered the market. They dominated and became the big three, that of which we see today. But Sonic was notorious. It developed the reputation for going against the head honcho, and people are not just going to forget that. So even though Sega's attempt at taking the crown failed, they weren't necessarily left in the dust, but they also didn't know what to do with Sonic. They experimented drastically with the games, which is where I was first introduced with Sonic Heroes. For me, this is the game that cemented Sonic in my mind. Basically, any game that I played with my sister left a big impact on me because I love my sister and she's super awesome, and I'm not going to stop bragging about how cool she is. And it's because I played this game so much. I am squarely in the field of liking 3D Sonic more than 2D Sonic. Yes, I am a masochist. Don't judge me. I still like 2D Sonic well enough. Please remaster Sonic Heroes. I know it's not financially feasible and it's not after, the reboot. So I know it won't happen, but please. It would be so cool. I would literally cry from joy. Speaking of reboots, the reboot of Sonic the Hedgehog took place for the 15th anniversary. And what better way to kick it off than with the most notoriously buggy game in the history of mankind, where we have children kissing animal alien hybrids. At least we got Silver and Blaze, they're cool. Now it's hard for me to entirely hate the 2006 game because this was still during the era where Sonic was still being a big risk taker. The stories had a big narrative, a solid idea for a massively cool story to unfold, and I've always appreciated that most about Sonic during this time. Also, I think Eggman looks awesome in this game. I loved this. Oh man, I was so hyped for this game when it came out, but I don't need to tell you that it was rushed and is known for being the worst game in the history of Sonic ever, at least from a technical standpoint. And this is also why so many people hate hearing, quote-unquote, Sonic has had a rough time since going 3D, because it's like rubbing salt in the wound of all Sonic fans who stuck through all this. Who played these games knowing they weren't really that good, but they loved Sonic that deeply that they didn't care. They just wanted to see Sonic keep going. We appreciated them trying new things, even if it didn't work. because the Sonic team trying something new means they cared. But also, you can just glitch to the end credits, and this is considered an acceptable speedrun for this game. It's so bad. The game is just ugly most times. You can listen to the apologia for this game, but the fact of the matter is, this was nearly a death sentence for Sonic. We had a handful of average games that were still experimenting with Sonic, that being Riders and Black Knight, so I guess the reboot didn't really do all that much in retrospect. But when Sonic Unleashed came out, most fans agree that, regardless of your opinion of the game, it was a step in the right direction. Because even though the Hedgehog part was hit or miss, the 3D speedrunning parts felt better than its predecessors, even though I honestly really liked Riders and would like to see that expanded again.
But why would Sonic be on a hoverboard? He can just run faster.
Because that would be cheating! It's a competition! There's rules, come on guys! Not that hard! It was from here that Sonic seemed to have a proper direction, or at least a better direction than throwing something at a wall and hoping it sticks. Now we have a cast of characters that isn't really gonna change that we can see in future games with cameos. Don't get me wrong, there's still experimentation, but now there's less fear that the next Sonic game will be like the 2006 game. Sonic has more of a fun approach to the games rather than the seriously edgy approach, which was a long time coming. Sonic was designed to be cool, but what's considered cool changes, and so Sonic had to change throughout time. Now we're reaching a point where Sonic is more stable with his character and the cast of characters. Now that we've covered the evolution of the games, what about everything else? Sonic has this interesting position where it feels equally American as it does Japanese. And that's largely due to the fact that it was Sega of America who were producing the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, or the Sonic Sat-Am Show, shortened from Sonic Saturday AM. This was released around the same time as Sonic CD, so really early in the lifetime of Sonic. I was only able to watch the Sonic Adventure and Sonic Sat-Am series by renting the VHS tapes or CDs from Hollywood Video. That's right, not Blockbuster. And as you can tell, there's a lot of characters that you really just don't see in the video games. The Sonic cartoons established even more characters that heavily focused on Sonic being a freedom fighter, taking the idea that Sonic is out there trying to save the cute little animals from being turned into robots by Dr. Robotnik. It was primarily a comedy, don't get me wrong, but this is where the lore of Sonic started getting confusing, because you essentially have two separate stories developing in two separate countries doing their own thing. The games always took priority, and the show or even the comic books would have to adapt to the canon of the games, and things got complicated. Real complicated. Don't even get me started on Sally Acorn and how she's been completely forgotten, even though they still have the rights to her character. I don't know why they just wouldn't use her when she's a real solid character, but I guess she's just isn't part of the reboot and the new direction that Sonic is going in, but whatever. You'll see these characters in the Archie comic books, which were based off the Saturday AM cartoon. And that's a whole can of worms I'll cover in just a second, but first let's finish the cartoons. But also now that everything is kind of complicated with Dr. Robotnik versus Eggman, I'm going to simplify it for all the new fans. They are the same person now. There was a big confusion where people thought Eggman and Robotnik were two different characters, which I'm pretty sure at one point they were, like Robotnik was supposed to be Eggman's dad or something. I get confused. I'm going off of knowledge that I was told in like elementary school, so it could be completely wrong even back then, you know. Children are not the most reliable source of information, but now that's not the case. Things got too complicated, they made it easy. I mean, heck, there was an origin story of Sonic where he was a normal hedgehog and turned into the blue blur because of Dr. Robotnik. But that's only because the origins of the comics don't necessarily align with the canon. They were kind of just doing their own thing and then retroactively made things canon or had to fit things to the canon because the games were number one canon. Everything else was secondary, and they just kind of had to backpedal on a lot of things or do a lot of uncomfortable things in order to make it technically work with the new canon. Wink, wink, Charmy B. The TV shows and the comics were to fill all the gaps of the story that was left open by the games. But they were given a lot of free reign over this, and not everyone was on the same page, so everything kind of just got all over the place. With all that being said, don't let that dissuade you. A lot of the peripheral creations around the games aren't canon anymore, but the stories are actually really interesting and fun. Heck, Sonic Underground doesn't even really line up with the canon of the Saturday AM cartoon. But the point was to be an interesting show that created a deeper connection between the Sonic franchise and its fans, even if it gets weird. These are beloved parts of the Sonic history that really shouldn't just be forgotten. These were responsible for filling in details for lore-hungry fans. Side note, there is a small amount of upset with the new announcement of the new voice actor for Sonic and Sonic Prime, primarily from racist dunderheads, but it should be stated that the original voice actor for Sonic cartoons was Jaleel White. Literally the Steve Urkel. So I say anyone that's currently upset with the current casting isn't a real Sonic fan. I mean, that's just stupid. Then we had Sonic X, which is actually developed in Japan, produced by Sonic Team. And so this aligns much more closely with the events in the game, especially in the later seasons where they basically ripped the plot of Sonic Adventure games in order to finish the show. But if I'm going to be honest, I never really could like this Sonic as much as the Sonic Sat-Am show, regardless of it having a superior opening song. There was something about the English dubbing that made it feel off somehow. Not only that, but the idea of having actual real-world people in the Sonic universe is divisive with the fan base. Some people don't have a problem, some people do. Some people point out that Eggman is a human, so there should be humans, but also Sonic and the rest are technically aliens, so that begs the question, why is Eggman there anyway? Shouldn't he be an animal? It's weird. Don't think about it too hard. Also, they established this whole new race that has been completely forgotten outside of Sonic X. I feel like out of everything, even though this show tried its hardest to be in line with the games, it's the one that's actually most out of place. When Sonic Boom started off, it was a weird time for Sonic. It was a comedy, but they made Knuckles just a dumb meathead. Also, they introduced Styx the Badger, which hasn't been forgotten outside of this show because a lot of people started off hating her and ended up loving her. But Sonic Team won't even let her appear in the comics, so that's frustrating. The fans really got upset with the redesigns of Sonic and mocked it, but after really watching the show and how the writing ended up being some of the funniest tongue-in-cheek jokes we've gotten, this show became a fan favorite. The video games ended up being absolute garbage, but it's also not considered quote-unquote real Sonic games, so they don't count it. People see these games more like a cartoon spin-off game rather than Sonic games. Now we get to the comic books. As I mentioned, the Sonic comics were based off the original cartoon series. Initially published in 1992, this series was published under Archie Comics, and largely followed the cartoon's plotline. And it had all those new characters that were beloved in the cartoon that we all know and love. I just repeated myself, that is the same thing. The comics, however, introduced a lot more characters because, of course, why wouldn't they? Some of them are actually really good. Characters that usually get a shock out of fans that have only played the games are like Uncle Chuck, literally Sonic's uncle. And he's from the cartoon. Like, he's not even an original character from the comic books. The cycle of Sonic characters that are created and then forgotten is longer than you would like to imagine. But the comics, I would argue, are even more important than the cartoon. The comics paved the way in order to fill up a lot of the lore that was left open by the video games. But the comics paved way for new and legitimately interesting stories. The fact that Archie Comics' Sonic run went largely under the radar, I feel is criminal. Because there wasn't really any communication between Japan's Sonic Team and the comic book creators, there was a lot of retconning they had to do and uncomfortable story choices they had to make in order to make it retroactively fit with the canon of the games. And the styles of the comics would radically change before they settled on an official style for the comic books. Before Yardley's style was cemented, every artist really just did their own thing, like John Gray making the style more animated with squash and stretch, similar to what you'd see in Disney cartoons. Also, this is Yardley's work. You can see how it looks like modern Sonic. It wasn't until Ken Penders one of the writers for the Sonic comics sued Archie and Sega for the rights to the characters that he introduced into Sonic lore, which is a lot of back and forth and a lot of complication and a lot of legalese. So to make things simple, he won the lawsuit. There is now several characters stricken from the official story, forcing the Archie comics to reboot the series. I started reading the Archie comics right before the reboot, where they had a team up with Mega Man, and a whole bunch of weird stuff happened, and I didn't understand what was happening because I didn't know there was this whole thing behind the scenes. The point is, Archie comics are really cool and worth reading. They are also very weird. Don't get me wrong. It is also incredibly odd a lot of the time, but you just move past that. There is a lot of good to discover in the Sonic comics. The very early editions or issues, like around issue 1, it's basically just the cartoon. So like, you're not really missing anything from that era. It isn't until the more modern comics, when you start hitting around the year 2000, where the story really starts to go off in its own direction, which is what you want. If you want to avoid all the really weird stuff, start around issue 200. So that's around where I started reading, and I never really had big problems with the story around that time, and that is past the point of when Ken Penders was writing. If you want to read Ken Penders' really weird stuff, go ahead and read everything before issue 200. But with that being said, it's still a mess. And most of it it's not even canon anymore. So it's hard to like actually recommend going back and reading the Sonic Archie run, because we know that either a lot of the characters just you're never gonna see again because Ken Penders took them, or it's just not part of the new direction that Sega and Sonic Team are taking the franchise. Ken Penders' artwork is largely mocked because of how weird it looks, but credit where it's due, he clearly wasn't trained for the very complicated and difficult way of drawing you have to learn for Sonic, but it still makes for great memes. Comic Drake, a good friend of mine, did a whole video breaking down what happened and just how unhinged Ken Penders is today. So if this topic interests you, then go check out their video. The license for the comics have been transferred from Archie to IDW. And Ian Flynn, who is a serious expert in literally everything Sonic the Hedgehog, is spearheading the entire story. He's been writing the comics since even before the reboot, and is largely credited for the incredibly well and thoroughly thought out constructed story that is the IDW run of comics. That of which fits perfectly with the canon of the current video games. So if you're more of a new fan, if you're someone who started watching the Sonic movies and jumped in and want to read the comics, if you go to the comic store today, you're going to find the Sonic comic books published by IDW, and that's really what you want to read. You cannot go wrong with literally any of the IDW comics as of the release of this video. Ian Flynn deserves a lot of credit, but it's not like he's the sole reason Sonic got good. I can't forget to mention Evan Stanley, who is also a writer on the comics, both IDW and on Archie. She's mostly known as an illustrator, but has been a mainstay on the comics team for a while, and has produced what I would argue is some of the best art for Sonic. Evan Stanley's art is now the cemented art style that most Sonic artists refer to. Tyson Hess, who not only worked on the Sonic comics, but also did a lot of animation work for Sonic Mania and is currently co-producing the Sonic movies. Nowadays, Sonic Team understands the popularity of Sonic outside of Japan. I'm pretty sure at this point it's literally more popular outside of Japan than it is inside of Japan. It's just too big to ignore. And they really started working with creators over here in America, some in Canada also, of course, in order to help better direct the direction that Sonic should go. Long story short, the Archie comics were cool, but bad. It got really bad, but they figured it out, and the comics are better now. If you're a new fan, don't worry about the Archie comics. Just read the IDW stuff. They are introducing all new characters, just like all they did before, and they even reference some of them in the new Sonic Frontiers game. And it feels like they aren't going to create this grandiose, massive, and conflicting storylines that they used to do in the Archie comics anymore. So the IDW comics feel very safe. Better yet, it feels like we're really entering a renaissance with Sonic right now. Not only did they fix Amy's character from being just an annoying Sonic obsessor to being a strong leader with an actual head on her shoulders, I really appreciate that. That It's really nice. That's probably that is the best thing that came out of Sonic Forces. But what really brought us into this new age are the Sonic movies. When this movie was announced, everyone who saw it knew it was just going to be a crappy kids movie with very little that actually does with Sonic. And, well, it was. But that's not how this movie became a massive success. You see...
Meow?
Everyone was so upset at how gross Sonic looked that the director said they were going to change the design. Now, this movie released in February of 2020, and this decision was made in May of 2019. And so they only had less than 10 months in order to fix the entire movie, which they probably did, or this was all a marketing stunt and this was the final design for Sonic all along, and they just made him look bad for the trailer to generate a lot of upset, which promoted the movie, and then they could swoop in and be the heroes by fixing the movie. No one really knows which is real. A lot of people debated which is which. The point is, it convinced a lot of people to go see the movie if they were willing to commit time in order to fix the disgusting original Sonic that they had. And so the movie was massively successful, and almost immediately a second movie was announced. In 2022, we got the second movie, which was actually like a Sonic movie. I usually explain the first movie is a kid's movie with Sonic, the second movie is a Sonic movie for kids. It was the success of those movies that got us Sonic Frontiers, which I argue is a good game. Not a good Sonic game, a good game. Because a good Sonic game is a whole different category all in itself. You know, the bar's a lot lower for a good Sonic game. This is just a good game. I'm not saying it's great, but it's good. I love Sonic. Sonic is one of those things that when it connects with you, it really connects with you. You can bash the games or the comics all you want, but you can't deny that Sonic has to be doing something right if it manages to stumble over itself over and over again and is still, to this day, culturally relevant. Sonic has managed to remain in the cultural zeitgeist for years while messing so many things up, and that's impressive. The history of Sonic itself is enough for it to not be forgotten. And the kind of gameplay that Sonic provides is something you just can't really get anywhere else. What I love about Sonic fans, myself included, is that we are willing to roll with the punches, knowing full well that there will be something good on the horizon. People focus on the blunders a lot, but there's just as much good as there is bad. Sonic has just had a really rocky road figuring out what it is. But now I feel like it's really found its footing, and it's starting to gain traction again. So long as there is something Sonic to consume, I will support this franchise. I'm ride or die. You know me. Hardcore, it's in my heart. It's not going away. I have very few things that I still have nostalgia for. Sonic is one of them. Tell me your favorite memories with Sonic the Hedgehog. How'd you get into Sonic? Are you a new fan? Are you an old fan? Don't forget to check out my Patreon and socials. I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay beautiful and keep playing.